going on to America now. For me, America really was for the longest time, one of the major, I suppose, counter forces within, against, I suppose, globalism of its day,
Mhm.
and even now to a certain point.
Yeah.
Um, but I think you touched upon it, but I was hoping you could go a little bit more in depth. Basically, could you explain exactly the purpose of America? Why was it such a threat, especially at the beginning with the founders, and then the whole when you reach into the Civil War period and the idea of the British Empire kind of hoping to regain the American Republic and take it back into its empire, and the whole I suppose not secret history, but um, um, unknown history of the whole relationship between Tsarist Russia and the Lincoln government, and
Yeah.
and how World War One could have erupted back then, but
Easily.
yeah, it's fascinating, and a lot of people don't know that. And when I say that to people, how Lincoln and Tsar Nicholas the First, who would think,
Lincoln
um,
was Alexander II was with
Alexander
Lincoln.
II. Yeah, sorry. They were trying to get rid of serfdom and slavery around the same time, and I think Russia really could be a another America. They have such a the landmass and the resources and the people and everything like that. But it's amazing. Most of its time, America and Russia has been placed in conflict to one another. I believe artificially so, because if those two ever got on the same page and be a force for good, I mean, I think it'd be game over for globalism.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
uh, that's where you go into Anthony Sattin's work and the whole, the monopolist capitalists of Wall Street supporting communism and bailing it out back in its early days after Lenin's revolution. There's so much there. Um,
hmm
so I was wondering if you could take some time and talk about America and talk about its role in the world and
yeah, sure.
and the whole clash of two Americas. How there's almost like
Yeah,
two two competing uh, versions of America, always trying to kind of jockey for control
yeah,
within itself.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
so it's complicated, but it's fascinating. So please, can you go into that bit?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, I think it's useful to think of a nation, a multi-generational process, like a nation with its character, and nations are obviously, they all have different characters. It's not black and white, and it's kind of like a person. We all have, we have things that we've done that we're proud of. We've things that we've done in our past that we're ashamed of. We wish we could have done better. We wish we'd have made different choices, and every person, until the very day you die, you're sort of an unfinished. There's always opportunity to change, and when sometimes we get into bad habits, it becomes more difficult to change for the good. And I think most people have some experience of that, whether they're wrestling with that now or whether they've gone through experiences of smoking or other habits, whatever it is. The brain gets into a bad way, you get into an addiction of some sort or another, and it becomes harder and harder to get back on the wise path, right? Not that you don't want to, but it becomes harder. And sometimes people cope by just pretending that the good path isn't there. They just ignore the conscience. It doesn't mean their conscience ceases to exist, but they choose to cut themselves off as much as they can just to be functional, because they lose a sense of belief that they could be otherwise, that they could get back to becoming somebody that they're proud of. And that's sad. It's tragic when that happens, and it's really tragic when that happens with somebody who has political power. And it's really beautiful when somebody who was on the wrong path is able to transform and become good. And I think that in our cynical society, we're very much immersed in a culture that reinforces the idea that human beings are corrupt. We can all believe very easily that good people can become corrupt, but it's very difficult for people to think about how people who were doing corrupt things can become good. But it's only by understanding both that you can get a sense of history. And the United States is definitely, you could learn a lot from from this way of thinking about the United States. Now, the United States did not survive 250 years by being simply an empire out suppressing the weak and running regime change operations to keep the world down. That's not how it survived. And in fact, that was, for most of that last 250 years and even 400 years, it's been typically the British Empire that was the empire doing that. And as we alluded to earlier in our discussion, it wasn't even the British people and it wasn't the British nation. It was this other thing that latched onto Britain as a control zone to carry out insidious operations which accompanied the growth of cultural processes that would encourage your victims to become corrupt, so that as they were corrupted, they would be less able to fight you off or defend themselves. That's part of the tool basket of empire. It's an art or a science, you could say, of corruption, of finding somebody's weakness and feeding their weakness. Look at where their hunger is, feed it, and make them then addicted to it, so that they're then beholden to who's feeding them. And they're also compromised. So if they do get a conscience and they want at some point to step out of line, you've always got their weakness that you filmed or whatever, right, that you can hold over their heads. So the U.S. originally emerged when you read the writings of many of those who founding fathers of the United States, and I would say especially Benjamin Franklin, and look at, well, what was animating their hearts and minds? What was their grand strategy? Why did they call, when it was still just 13 colonies declaring independence, why did they call it the Continental Congress, the Continental Army? They obviously had a bigger vision, despite the fact that 90% of the continent was run by, the British, the French empires, the Spanish empires, and the Russian empires. That was most of North America. And then you had the 13 colonies. So there was a much grander design. And if you look at how did it happen, it couldn't have happened were it not for, one, Benjamin Franklin's prestige as having been somebody who was able to make a discovery that none of the great minds, the arrogant, great educated minds of Europe, were able to make, in terms of the nature of electricity and lightning, which in Ben Franklin's mind was always interconnected with his overarching understanding of natural law, not just in physics, but in the moral law, in political freedom. It was always two sides of the same thing, but he won over a big chunk of supporters that he was able to transform from amongst the elite and the scientists and the statesmen of Europe, as well as of India and other countries. And they called him the Prometheus of America. This guy with a grade 3 education, not born from a royal family, was able to make a great discovery, and one which had powers of increasing our ability to have dominion over nature, right? Lightning rods, other forms of inventions, and an entire basis of a way of thinking about economy emerged, which is, Ben Franklin was actually an economist. People don't know that. He refuted the depopulation agenda in his observations on the increase of mankind in 1851. He was one of the driving forces of creating a paper currency founded upon the investments into manufacturing in his necessities of a paper script. He printed it in his printing houses. He was printing the Philadelphia paper money systems. And it was all tied to an idea that money was not a value unto itself because people wanted it. That's what the British say, but that's not reality. The reality is that money is something which is an invention, a creation that humans make to facilitate the growth of the productive powers of labor, the growth of manufacturing, the growth of new inventions, which is why he was also a driving force behind like the creation of patents, so that every citizen who has a good idea could create also a financial incentive to their good ideas. It doesn't mean you should patent life the way Monsanto does, but it's based on the idea that the mind is the source of the value. And when you bring people into a state of harmony with the general welfare of their nation, it's because you're encouraging the nation to both increase the quality of life of all people, but also incorporate the ideas, the good ideas of the people that participate in the overarching evolution and survival of the society that goes on beyond their lifetimes. So Ben Franklin had this whole thing. So how did that succeed? As like the biggest army of the world, the British Empire, being defeated by these like farmers. Well, you had to get, you know, German, Prussian, Polish, Irish leading generals, military men, scientists, Marquis de Lafayette from France. You know, Ben Franklin was organized the French government to support the cause of the Americans in 1777. That was the American French Treaty, or 78. Russia, you know, Ben Franklin became a member. He organized the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Ekaterina Dashkova, also an incredible 32-year-old woman reformer, you know, president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, who then made Ben Franklin. So he became a member of that, and she became the first Russian member of his philosophical society, which had international networks. He organized through his French contacts, who many of whom were, again, the scientist statesman thing was much more common. The greatest, you know, leader of the French Revolution early on, who ended up getting his head cut off, was Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who was known as the Ben Franklin of France. He was the president of the L'Assemblée, who organized the tennis court oath. But through these French contacts, he was able to organize Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, the Muslim revolutionaries of India, southern India, in the Mysore region, to fight the British and declare independence in 1779. And in 1780, they fully launched in, and Tipu Sultan was writing letters to the Continental Congress saying, our fight is your fight. And they absorbed 20% of the British Navy to have to fight the Indians, who understood that. And when you read these letters from Tipu Sultan, that there was a new age of reason and brotherhood that had nothing to do, that transcended religious differences. You know, these were Muslims working with, you know, the Christian world, everybody. And Sidi Muhammad of Morocco, the Emperor of Morocco, was keeping all of the American ships safe from Barbary pirates who were deployed and working closely with the British East India Company to destroy American ships. Morocco was the first nation in the world under Sidi Muhammad to recognize American independence in 1777. The United States was the first battleship that was part of the American Navy, was called the Hyder Ali, based on the revolutionary father of Tipu Sultan, again, a Muslim, right? And it carried out many battles with the British. So, you know, you've got this process where there was a whole understanding that we were on the cusp of a new breakthrough for the species, that the species would finally break away from becoming an oligarchical sort of, you know, plaything, talking cows to be controlled by a master class. And instead we would have an age not by hereditary power, but the consent of the governed, and the idea of the inalienable rights of all people being what defines international law, national law, everything. And that was subverted. Unfortunately, the US didn't consolidate its ideals. There were fifth columnists, what we today call deep state operations, embedded still within the young America in its early days. This is what killed Alexander Hamilton. This is what set up Wall Street by Aaron Burr and the maneuver he did, stealing public money to create the Bank of Manhattan in 1798. This is what's been there the whole time, as the Eastern establishment banking families, the Cushings, I mean, there's a whole network that ran the opium trade with the British, starting in the early 1800s. And this is what killed Lincoln. This is what killed, before Lincoln, it killed Zachary Taylor and Harrison. This is what killed the National Bank under Jackson, 1836. It's what killed later on JFK. And it's deeply embedded in Canada. That's a key control center. You have a big chunk of it that's in the United States. And it's not American, it's not really Canadian as such, it's something else. And that's the thing. So that's what's been there the whole time. That's what I believe, that there was this better America that was reactivated when Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. And personally, I thought that it had been extinguished after Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968. I didn't think personally that there was a powerful enough nationalist patriotic dynamic of that still existed at this late stage of the rot. And I was shocked. I was surprised that it was able to organize itself in such a manner that Hillary was able to lose. You got a nationalist outsider who was brought in, who had his problems, but definitely didn't play according to the script that was being expected of him, which was great. And so, you know, it's given us, I think, a certain amount of, it bought us time. And the oligarchy has been scrambling to reconsolidate their power in the United States after they lost 4 years of their planning. And, you know, nations of Eurasia, especially, which has done a much better job of weeding their deep state gardens than we have been able to take that time and really organize something that is premised on a viable alternative political economic system, which can actually float. Again, there's problems with everything. There's nothing that is pure. There's no pure nation state that's crystallized in this world, but they've actually put online, knowing that the current system in the West it's set to blow. They've spent the last few years building up something much, much more viable and premised on a certain competency in banking, in long-term credit emissions for big projects, a certain open system approach to thinking instead of thinking about population control. There's a pro-industrial growth orientation. All very good. Those are good things you can work with. So we're at that point. That's where we're at right now.